Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue titled Middle East on the Brink, Potential Paths for De-escalation. My name is Mihai Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst here at the European Policy Center, and I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion. Before we start, I'd just like to make an announcement that this is the first event in a series that we've started, a series that would look to take stock of the developments in the Middle East, to provide analysis, but also potential paths for de-escalation in the region. We plan to hold these discussions every month, bringing together different views and also discussing from different angles, from geopolitical, from a security angle, from a humanitarian angle, economic, and others. Now a couple of thoughts about the discussion today. Then I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to kick off the discussion. We've seen in the past year and a couple of months that many red lines have evaporated in the Middle East. We've seen an unprecedented level of escalation, immense humanitarian suffering. We've seen an inability from the EU and the US to help the parties reach a ceasefire. So we're at the moment that's probably the most dangerous in the past couple of decades. The discussion today is meant to take stock of the recent developments, to analyze the potential for escalation, to analyze the potential for de-escalation at the moment, but also to analyze what the EU can do more and what the EU can do in this new political cycle. To answer and to discuss all these issues, we have an excellent panel this morning with us, and I'm just going to introduce you one by one as I see you on my screen. We have with us Almut Möller, who's the Director for European and Global Affairs and Head of the European World Program at the European Policy Center. We have Christian Hanelt, who's a Senior Expert for the Middle East with the Bertelsmann Stiftung. We have Adnan Tabatabai, who's the CEO of CARPO. And last but not least, we have Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, who's a Senior Analyst with Control Risks and an Associate Fellow with Chatham House. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Now, a couple of thoughts on the run of show. So we'll start with a couple of questions to our speakers. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll open the Q&A with the audience. In order to ask a question, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A one, and please pose your question there. I will read it out loud, and then we'll see who's best placed to address it. Since we only have 1 hour this morning, I encourage you to pose your questions early on, and we'll open quite soon the Q&A session. And I think without further ado, I would go directly to our panel, and I'm looking at you, Aniseh. And my first question is, if you can sort of give us an overview of recent developments in the region. What is the potential for escalation at this point? The potential, of course, for de-escalation, and then we'll take the discussion from there. The floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and obviously it's a very timely discussion. We are just over a year since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas conflict, and I think you mentioned this as being one of the most dangerous period, if not the most dangerous period in recent decades. I would argue that this is also the most dangerous in the recent year since the beginning of the conflict in itself. There have been lots of concerns and red flags raised throughout this year about a potential for the conflict to become a regional conflict. And I think we are closer than ever becoming the case. And this is because of the recent development that you referred to. I think, the two sides, so we are looking at obviously Israel on one side, Hamas and the other Iran-backed groups across the region. On the other side, we have had, if you wish, a strategy of having an indirect confrontation, with the exception of Gaza for the past year. The two sides have had different confrontations, but these were mainly not direct. And I think they kept the rules of engagement very clear, with the exception of April, when Iran and Israel had some direct confrontation triggered by an attack by Israel to the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which led to then an Iranian retaliation, the first ever retaliation directly in Israel territory, and then to Israel retaliating in turn within the Iranian territory. But I think even then, the two sides decided quite quickly to go back to what were the rules of the game up until then, with the indirect confrontation becoming, again, like the preferred way to continue their strikes across the region. I think, what we have seen, especially since July, the end of July, however, has been different. I would say that the start of this recent escalation has been the killing by Israel of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. That was followed by a series of operations by Israel in Lebanon, which then led to the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, together with other very senior officials, both within Hezbollah, but also within the IRGC. And this was on the 27th of September. After that, I think what we have seen is basically an Iranian decision to retaliate in turn, directly conducting an attack in Israel against Israeli military intelligence targets on the 1st of October. And we can talk a lot about why Iran did that. I think Adnan might be covering that more in detail. But I think what we have seen since is that the rules of the engagement might have changed, and the two sides might not be content to basically contain their confrontation to indirect strikes anymore. And there is a very significant risk of this escalation to becoming even more regional than it is right now. We know that Israel obviously now has two fronts open, one in Gaza and one in Lebanon, but the risk of opening another front directly with Iran is very high. Over the past 2 weeks, Israel has often stressed that it will retaliate against Iran, with speculations about what that will look like, ranging from, if you wish, lower escalatory targets, ranging from military facilities to military targets, to the higher escalatory end that includes nuclear facilities and even political leaders. And in the middle, there have been also speculations about potential oil facilities and infrastructures becoming a potential target to basically attack the Iranian economy. So we have seen the three ends of the potential escalation and retaliation that Israel would conduct against Iran, with fluctuating preference for one or the other. And we know consultation with the United States in particular about how to go about it. We know that a retaliation by Israel against Iran is different than a retaliation or a confrontation in Gaza or Lebanon. It's much more complicated military-wise. It's also much more politically sensitive. And therefore, I think the level of consultation between Israel and the United States has been significant. That doesn't mean that Israel necessarily will abide by what are the constraints or pressure, assuming there are any, from the Western side and the US in particular. So we are now in a wait-and-see situation about basically seeing what Israel will do. We know that, again, Iran is likely to retaliate, no matter what the response by Israel will be. They have been talking about a response in kind. Again, Adnan, I'm sure will cover that. But I think, again, like we are in a cycle of escalation, which is quite dangerous. And I think without any direction towards path of de-escalation, as you put it, we are likely to see this third front opening up, and therefore leading to what we have feared so far, so a regional war actually taking place. I leave it there, and then I can probably develop in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Aniseh. You gave us the overview. Thank you very much for touching upon this this cycle of escalation that might continue, and we might end up in an even more dangerous situation than now. Thank you also for touching upon the U.S. angle. I'm sure we'll come back to that. We'll also come back to Iran with Adnan, and then with you, of course, as well. Maybe I'll just stay for a moment with you and ask you about the ceasefire in Gaza with the intensifying, of course, Israeli operations in Lebanon. We've seen that the ceasefire in Gaza doesn't seem to be any longer in the attention of the international community. Are there any developments on that side?
Well, it's a great question. I think, you know, the only signal that we have seen of not talks about ceasefire, but some pressure on Israel changing its behavior has been this letter that the Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin sent to Israel, I think on Monday, which asked for Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza within 30 days. I think, you know, there is a recognition that now Israel is not willing to consider ceasefire. I think, if anything, Lebanon might be more a theater in which ceasefire could be discussed, and we can talk about that. But with Gaza, I don't think there is any readiness by Israel, and therefore the focus has been so far from the US side for the first time to actually constrain the questions and demands to the humanitarian side, especially given the recent developments and horrible attacks that we have seen in Gaza over the past few days. So I don't think ceasefire is in the cards in the conversations. And if anything, I think the Hezbollah front is more likely to be prioritized in terms of discussing a ceasefire, with Gaza being sidelined for the time being, sadly.
Right. Thank you. I would turn now to you, Christian, and my question is: where does is the EU in all this this equation? Where does the EU stand, and what the EU could do more? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mihai. Good morning, everybody. Yes, the EU is quite divided between member states regarding assessment and action regarding the 7 dimensions of the current Middle East war. I would like to shortly look into these 7 dimensions and shed some light on EU actions and positions. These 7 dimensions are interlinked with each other. From my point of view, in the center stays and will stay the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is why I want to say that dimension 1 and 2, the Hamas-Israel war in Gaza, as well as the continuous violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, somehow interconnected with each other. Aniseh has described the situation in Gaza, in the West Bank, and also in East Jerusalem. There's fighting against terror cells, especially with Islamic Jihad, but especially the expel of Palestinians, the confiscation of Palestinian land by extremist settlers. The minimal consensus of EU and EU member states is to deliver humanitarian aid, to support the Palestinian Authority, to sanction a couple of extremist settlers, to declare the right of self-defense for Israel, at the same time saying that there is a respect to international humanitarian law, and calling Hamas to release the hostages unconditionally. Then it comes to the declaration of a two-state solution and its promotion, also with the ceasefire. This is orally, this is on all EU declarations, but real action on the ground to show that one is committed with a two-state solution is quite limited. You see this, for example, in a dispute between member states regarding a recognition of a Palestinian state. On the one hand, for example, Hungary and the Czech Republic, who refuse it, and on the other hand, Belgium, Spain, who are promoting it very strongly. It's interesting to see that the declaration from Friday of the meeting of the Med-9, these are the 9 EU member states who are coasting to the Mediterranean. When you read the declaration, it's much more clearer than the Council declarations regarding two-state solution. For example, they are very much more explicit to say it's consisting of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and saying much more couple of details. The EU, still in office, the EU High Representative is trying to work on the diplomatic front. From the European side, the only, let me say, plan of conflict resolution on the ground is his plan from January, the 10-point peace plan, which basically tries to assemble all potential mediators of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution together, and he tries, together with the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, to assemble the promotion of the recognition of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. And both of them, let me say, the GCC countries and the EU, try to somehow, when I see this on the diplomatic front, to connect this Borrell 10-point plan together with the Biden ceasefire plan, as well as with the Arab Vision plan, which is the Arab contribution of Qatar, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. So far, it's diplomatic efforts, but when you look into the EU voting in the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, you see that almost the divide continues. There is in the front of very, let me say, pro-Netanyahu voting the Czech Republic and Hungary, and let me say the far more other side with Spain, Ireland, Belgium, in between the number of EU member states who say not yes and not no, but stay neutral, is increasing. There might be a chance that with the new EU Commissioner for the Mediterranean, as well as with the new High Representative, Madame Callas, there is let me say, a more push, more commitment for stronger EU joint action regarding solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but really with more dynamic, maybe. The third dimension, Aniseh spoke about the Hezbollah-Israel war in South Lebanon. You've told us some of the details. The EU minimal consensus is to give as much as possible financial support to the, let me say, to the ministries, Lebanese ministries, just to keep somehow of central governance in place to deliver humanitarian aid, because the amount of displacement in Lebanon is quite high and seen in the EU as also dangerous regarding flight and migration. There is a strong wording regarding the UNIFIL protection, because a lot of EU member states are having soldiers on the ground. So there's a strong political backing of UN Resolution 1701, which also means regarding Hezbollah to really pull back and to disarm, at least in the south. France plays here the central role as EU member state together with the US. The fourth dimension is in Syria, the military attacks of Israel on Iran and Hezbollah-affiliated militias in Syria. Here, you know that there is, in the recent years, quite a divide of EU member states how to deal with the Assad leadership, keeping in mind that some member states think that Syrian refugees who are currently in Europe might be easier to be returned to the Assad-held Syria if there are diplomatic relations. But in Syria, it's Turkey, it's the US, it's Russia, it's Israel and Iran who are the key players. EU and member states are really, so far, not playing a role. Then on the fifth dimension, it's Iraq. There are also Iranian-affiliated militias. Sometimes a drone or rocket is sent to Israel or to US military bases around Jordan or in the east of Syria. The sixth dimensions is something where the EU is really active. It's about the Houthi militias rocket firing on Red Sea shipping, as well as on Israel and Israeli military reactions to that. The EU has an own marine mission protection. Some member states are contributing. It's somehow connected with the US and British efforts to secure shipping through the Red Sea. However, at least 60 to 70% of the shipping through the Red Sea is stopped and surrounded around Africa. This has a lot of financial and economic consequences for the EU internal market and our economies. Supply chains and trade routes are put under pressure, and it means also for the EU budget that more and more financial support for Egypt is needed, because Egypt is losing a lot of financial taxes are coming out from the Suez Canal. And finally, seventh, the Israeli-Iranian direct confrontation, which Aniseh described. There's also the angle of the challenge of the possible weaponization of the nuclear program and the missile program. Here, the EU and G7 statements are strong. They're warning Iran to strike Israel again. They are requiring a decrease of supporting the militias in the region by the Iranian leadership. They increase sanctions. There's also a current discussion on sanctioning the Iranian Revolutionary Guards on several levels. There's especially, and this is really something what the EU member states is running negatively regarding the Iranian leadership. That is the fact that the weapon supply of Iran to Russia, which helps Russia to continue its war on Ukraine. EU, I see France to have some leverage due to its direct contact with the new Iranian president, but all other EU member states and the EU together, I don't see much influence on Iranian regional policies. But here, perhaps also Adnan can put some more light on this issue. That's so far from me here. But I wanted to say that really there is a danger of further escalation, suffering, and violence. That is for sure. I share what Aniseh said, and with a lot of far-reaching further consequences, and a real challenge to EU foreign policy. And here I come back that there is some hope that the new setup of the EU Commission may perhaps strengthen European foreign policy activity in the region to bring more peace and conflict resolution to our direct neighborhood in the south. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. You certainly brought multiple dimensions to the discussion. So thank you for that. Thank you also for bringing the Middle East peace process back into discussion. That was also something on my mind. What are actually the prospects now to have a real peace process for the future, given the future event? Maybe this is something to further reflect on. Also, thank you for pointing out the disunity between EU member states when it comes to the Middle East. You also brought, of course, Iran into the discussion and the state of the nuclear program. I'm sure we'll come back to that as well. And also you mentioned, of course, the Red Sea, and another very important dimension in the discussion, and the impact that it has, of course, on shipping, on the EU, and even the global impact. I'll just turn now to Adnan, and then I'll come back to you, Christian, with a couple of questions. Adnan, I'm looking at you, remembering also some of our conversations from a previous event we had this year, and what I remember from that was your optimism. I hope you still hold some of that optimism in your assessments. I would like to ask you, what is the strategic calculation in Tehran at the moment, and what is the risk of escalation? Maybe you can build up on some points that Aniseh and Christian already made. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihai, for setting this up. Thank you to my wonderful colleagues. Good to see all of you. Before I enter the analytical sphere, allow me to say, as I am currently also in the region, there is an 8th dimension that has to be added to what Christian wonderfully outlined, and that is what this war is doing to people that almost relate directly, if not indirectly, with what's going on on Palestinian territories, on what's going on inside Israel, on what's going on in Lebanon and elsewhere. Aniseh mentioned that this idea of a regional war is becoming a reality, and I think we discussed this in our previous event, Mihai, and I come back to this analogy of the frog in hot boiling water, and that water has been getting hotter and hotter without the frog realizing that it is cooking. And we have seen the list of countries directly impacted by this war growing ever since this war started. And the reason why I mention this is that all of us, even those who are not in the region, know someone either personally or through friends who are directly impacted. And it is very difficult to keep a cool head in these times. And it's very difficult to really remain balanced, sober, and analytical. And so I salute you for calling on all of us to do that. And what I'm going to discuss briefly here with regards to Iran is not meaning to either glorify or demonize what Iran is doing, but to help us understand what the Iranian position is in order to be able to anticipate maybe future steps and work on what you outlined, potential paths to de-escalation. So when I look at Tehran in the past weeks and months, and obviously my optimism has faded that we shared in the previous event, is that on the one hand, it is very, very clear that Iran's leadership does not want this war. And the reason for that is, first, the top brass of Iran's military and security strategists has always been very aware of the military inferiority of the country vis-a-vis adversaries such as Israel or the US. So there is no one having the illusion in Iran that a war of this magnitude could be won, or that, in fact, militarily, Iran is superior. That's one reason. The other reason is, and the more recent one, is that since April, even before Masoud Pezeshkian became president, there was a bit of a strategic shift happening that in Tehran that basically postulated to try and ease tensions with the West. And when I say the West, mainly with the US. There have been a lot of different channels going on between Tehran and Washington since April, and their effort was mainly about trying to avoid the Gaza war spilling over into Lebanon. Here we are. That didn't work out, which is obviously a reason why I'm less optimistic than I used to be a few months ago. Not wanting the war, however, does not mean that Iran isn't ready and willing to retaliate anything that's happening. Iran will remain in its reacting mode, which has come under severe criticism domestically, to always wait for the adversary to do something and then Iran reacting to it. But it is quite clear that any action that is going to be undertaken on Iranian territory in particular will be retaliated. And here we have seen also a shift in the past few weeks and months, that while it was all about trying to restore deterrence when we are thinking about what happened in April, the last October attack showed that Iran is now also willing to, and I would call it, counter-escalate. When I say counter-escalate, I mean that Iran is still in a reacting mode, but doesn't mind to escalate while reacting to another strike or something that may happen on Iranian soil. There are clear messages sent what that counter-escalation might be. So what we saw on October 1st could be easily shifted up in scope in terms of the number of missiles. And for those in the audience and among us who do know a bit about Israel's military defense system, it's basically math. How many missiles can this super advanced defense system intercept? And that number has to be obviously outweighed by the number of missiles Iran is willing to launch. And that doesn't change with the thought system now being deployed in Israel. And that is a serious concern, obviously, because things can really escalate further. In its reacting mode, what I just outlined is the military posture that Iran is doing. So we hear regularly military personnel and others speaking about what Iran is willing and ready to do should Israel launch another attack. And here we have to also understand Iran is 5 times or more than 4 times as big as Germany as a country, and therefore doesn't feel existentially threatened and maybe more willing to even take a few blows, but then counter those attacks, which makes, again, I'm talking about the rationale behind those that make these decisions. The other posture is a diplomatic posture that we have seen in New York with the trip of President Pezeshkian and his foreign policy team. There have also even been promising talks with E3 political directors happening, and that was basically New York, one could say, was outreach primarily to, let's say, the so-called West, whereas right now Iran's foreign minister is here in the region, traveling. He traveled to Riyadh, then to Doha. He was yesterday in Muscat, is today going to be in Egypt, and then planning to go, in Jordan, and is then planning to go to Egypt and Turkey. And obviously that trip is meant to, on the one hand, send signals about Iran's positioning, to sort of try and rally the voices from these countries around any attempt to reach a ceasefire in Gaza, addressing the first two dimensions Christian outlined. And this diplomatic posture is obviously also accompanied by what I would say upping the strategic ambiguity about Iran's nuclear program. Christian also mentioned that. So Iran is playing with this idea that there might be a shift in its country's nuclear doctrine. Would a decision towards nuclear weaponization lead to military strikes against Iran's nuclear sites? I assume so, and I think the Iranians do also believe so. But does that hold them back, and will that effectively derail Iran's nuclear program? I would probably think no, that's not the case. So what I'm outlining is, again, a very, very dangerous picture, and I'm honestly getting tired of us having to say for more than 12 months in what kind of a dangerous situation we're in, and continuing to see the incapability of European and American governments to do something about it. Why am I addressing American and European policymakers? Because as a European citizen, I expect more from them than I expect from countries that are directly affected by this war, emotionally, strategically, militarily, economically. And I want to end with an analogy before heading it back to you, Mihai, and that is in Europe. Imagine you're sitting in a restaurant, you're having your wonderful candlelight dinner, you're seeing two people at the bar of that restaurant starting a fight. You may at the beginning in your comfort just watch them having that fight, but once that fight basically explodes into a big brawl in the restaurant, destroys your candlelight dinner and the event that you've had there, you will regret why you didn't do anything earlier to stop that fight from happening. And Europe is much closer to this theater than any other Western partner is. Therefore, I would really hope that your series, and with Almut at the top of that series, I'm positive that that will happen. You can do some of the wake-up calls that are necessary so that the European discourse on all of this becomes more sophisticated, more realistic, and gains some more teeth. Back to you, Mihai.
Thank you, Adnan. Thank you very much. Also for ending on this note with the analogy and on the need for the EU to do more. We'll go back to the EU in 1 second. Just wanted to sort of highlight some of the points that you mentioned that I think are very important. One is, of course, this 8th dimension of people. Of course, that the impact on people is. It's great. It's huge. I mean, it's definitely, it needs, it should be the main driver for the international community to do more. Thank you also for hinting at the paths for de-escalation, which is one of the topics of this event, to look at how the situation could be de-escalated. And thank you also for giving us some insights into the Iranian decision-making thinking and rationale. With that in mind, I'll come back to Iran in a few minutes. I just want to give the floor to Almut now to give us her thoughts and also bring more of the EU perspective, especially on the note that you ended with, Adnan, that the EU needs to do more. Almut, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mihai, colleagues. It is good to be here. And Adnan, I take this very much as a motivation, but also a high bar for the work that we are doing at the EPC, because as Christian pointed out and colleagues made very clear, this is a very dangerous and very complicated environment. And Christian, I very much liked you bringing in a very nuanced way the different layers and arenas of the conflict/wars, and also be nuanced about the European position, possible contributions, but also limitations to a European role. And with the European role, I mean both the European Union and member states, which in itself is complicated, as we know. But since Christian zoomed in very granularly, which is important, I would like to widen the lens a little bit towards the end of this conversation before we go into the Q&A and look at the overall situation here, looking outside of my window as Brussels is getting ready for a new day with the first EU GCC meeting at leaders level, with the European Commission getting into gear, pending hearings in the European Parliament. And I just want to make the big observation and the broad observation, which is important, of course, for the Middle East, is that the European Union over the past years has changed tremendously, because Europe has changed tremendously. And I know Christian and others have been tirelessly working on the southern Mediterranean. We've seen the aspirations of the European Union and member states, both with regard to the southern Mediterranean and its eastern neighborhood, being positive and high starting decades ago. But what we see now is a completely different situation. We see the conflicts that colleagues have described in the Middle East, but we also see a Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, a sovereign country in the heart of Europe, and Europeans learning to become a security actor in their own right. And this is something that carries weight and relevance for talking about what European contributions to the Middle East are. Very clearly, and can be in the future, very clearly, the European Union is in a process, but this process is taken very seriously to develop own contributions, to understand better what an EU contribution can be to security and defense, a stronger European and EU-European pillar within NATO, and doing that with member states and also with other European allies, such as the UK. This is a very serious effort at this point in time that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is leading. There has been a lot of attention on this, trying to understand to what extent the EU as such could make a contribution, since the weight of security and defense is carried by the member states, of course, in particular. But I think this is important because so far the Union has been a trade power, and it has to learn the language of security and defense. And this goes back to what Adnan said. When we as analysts pointed out for a long time that our southern neighborhood is very close to us, this in some or another way didn't fully resonate. But what has resonated, of course, is the territorial nearness of a full-scale invasion and war of Russia, completely illegitimate, against Ukraine. And so in this context, I think it is important for us to look at the ambition of the European Union and member states to become more engaged in European security and playing their own role. Why is that important? Because when you're looking at the conflicts in the Middle East, that, needless to say, you can carry weight not only as a trade power. That is something very significant that makes the European Union very interesting. I say that also with regard to ongoing conversations with GCC countries, trying to see where the Union can pull its weight and find common ground in economic and trade areas. But at this point in time, it's particularly important to look at the security dimension of things. And here, with trying to understand what role the Union can play in the future, I think it will be vital that in my analysis, at least, there is a clear path mapped out and a serious political commitment by the leadership in the European Commission and by key member states to say we have no choice, and that will also add to the weight of the European Union, hopefully in a more significant way than in the past, and that would change also, I think, the potential for the Union to engage in the conflict layers in the Middle East. I just want to underline something very important that Adnan said. Of course, I'm an analyst, but the human side of things and the humanitarian side of things is a very important one. And I know Christian didn't mean it like this when we say there's common ground to be found on humanitarian aid. That is one of the areas where there is actually a common ground amongst the EU member states. This is something very important at this point in time. This is an area where the Union and member states really cannot fail. The human dimension is absolutely tragic and needs full attention and also clear messaging. Now, sort of looking a little bit at what I expect from the Commission and from Chihaia, the new High Representative. I think I'm a little bit more sort of hesitant to believe that Kallas and also her now, for the time being, designate Commissioner for the Mediterranean can give the attention and the time to our southern neighborhood that it requires. And that is simply because I assume that the conflict and the war against Ukraine will take so much time and attention. I mean, let's not forget it. This is something that is very real for member states, including arms deliveries, etc. This is a full-on engagement that will absorb a lot of attention. But where I see movement is there is a commissioner for the Mediterranean now. And if you look at the mandate, and I know this is something that colleagues also have been arguing for, and I think it is important to have someone who will be closely working with Chihaia, who carries a lot of weight, Kallas herself as a leader, to be present in the region. And again, this is no small thing. Let's not underestimate this. To be around the tables, to hope for the interest of those countries that the Union wants to engage with and can engage with, is something we've taken for too long for granted. And to have someone who is helping to bring that about, to have the backing, of course, of Chihaia, the Commission President, and hopefully also of EU leaders, is also no small thing. But I'm a little bit cautious to sort of overdo this. One final point, the divisions within the European Union. I fully agree with Christian. They are there, they are visible. We cannot do them away. Analytically speaking, I would also say I am not surprised at times, because this is what happens when you want a union to work together. My expectation is never things work smoothly right from the start, but there is a difference in interest, different history, etc. But what we need to have is a serious attempt to work on that. If at the end, and here I place high expectations in the new leaders in the EU institutions, to overcome some of those divisions and to find priority areas with regard to the Middle East where the Union is actually unified. This would help tremendously, and it needs work to start at home. And I'm not sure this has been done significantly enough over the past years. And here I think the Union also really needs to become honest, embrace the fact that there might be areas where difference cannot be overcome, but embrace also those where it is possible. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Almut, for bringing more to this EU perspective. I think from your intervention two major points. One is the last one you just mentioned, that of course we need more efforts to work to mend these divisions inside the EU before we think more strategically about the future of EU engagement in the Middle East. And the second one is that of course there is concern regarding how much attention the new High Representative will pay to the Middle East. We have a commissioner for the Mediterranean, so there is scope to expand EU focus on the region. With that, I would like to open now the Q&A with the audience. So please feel free to pose your questions in the chat. I see for the moment no questions, so I'm going to use my role as moderator to ask a few, if I may. And one relates to back to Iran, and I'm looking at you, Aniseh, and I know that Adnan touched a little bit about the ambiguity around the Iranian nuclear program, and I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on how that might develop in the future.
Well, this is a very important issue at the moment for Iran. We have seen discussions about a potential revision of the nuclear doctrine intensifying, I would say, already since April. So these have, a direct linkage with escalation with Israel. And I think confirm our sense of those Iran watchers that, saw the Iranian nuclear program as a deterrent tool mainly. And I think the fact that these conversations are so intensified after the intensification of escalation with Israel signals that, they come up when there is a sense of potential weakness of the current deterrent tool at Iran's disposal, and they need to intensify those. So I think the more Iran feels threatened, the more Iran feels weak, insecure, the more likely it is that the nuclear conversation and the weaponization of its nuclear program becomes a thing. And I very much agree with what Adnan said. It is a gamble for Iran to even discuss this, or even more to move towards weaponization should they decide to go down that road, because they would be further vulnerable to attacks by Israel, potentially in coordination with the United States as well, because we know this is supposedly a red line. But at the same time, in a situation of weakness and perceived insecurity and lack of other options, then, the gamble is going to be somewhat weighted by Iran, and potentially a push towards that direction could take place. So I wouldn't exclude it. I think it's already very concerning that this conversation is so much open and so much intensified. And I think, if I were in the Western minds, I would try to reassure somehow Iran that the security threat can be contained, that we can go back to a situation, to the list in which this direct escalation between Iran and Israel, and now from Israel towards Iran, should not be considered as a threat by Iran, and that the deterrent tools that Iran has in its cards are sufficient to deter an escalation and deter a potential attack by Israel or other external actor, including the United States. If that is not the case, and then I think it's very likely that Iran could actually opt for a weaponization of its nuclear program. We have seen, as I said before, the attack on the 1st of October also being, a signal that the rules have changed, the conversation has shifted, and Iran has been open to taking gambles that was not open to take before. So I think it's a consideration that should be taken, and a concern that should be weighted in the West.
Thank you, Aniseh. Maybe I just want to go back to a point that Almut made regarding the EU-GCC summit that is happening today, and I'm looking at you, Christian, and I just wanted to see your take about potential outcomes of the summit, priorities for both EU and GCC, and more overly, where what's the direction of the EU-GCC relations, please.
The Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab countries there, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, have become more relevant in the region, also in regional de-escalation. They took own initiatives, like I said in the beginning, the Arab Vision Plan, for example, or also trying to influence Iranian policymaking in the region, try to de-escalate here. For the EU, in this regard of conflict resolution, the GCC is of the importance, hoping that the GCC member states who are in Abraham Accords relations with Israel, that they have a chance to influence military decision making in Israel, as well as with their relations in Iran, because they are on a path of cooperation and dialogue with Iran here to contribute to de-escalation. On the other hand, the GCC heads of states, they require from the EU, and they say it here and there, that you have leverage on Israel, you have leverage on the US, use your diplomatic potential, your political potential, to influence military decision-making of the Netanyahu government. But there are three other issues which are of importance. Just putting a light on it, it is respectful mobility for the GCC people regarding visa policies towards the EU. There is the potential of green energy transition cooperation, and the old standing issue of a joint free trade area in order to boost economic relations. So these are the dimensions, and because there is wealth, financial wealth and political will in the GCC countries, their cooperation technically and administratively to also advance alternative energy exploration has a potential. Mihai, let me say one word to Almut's important exploration, how to describe the EU efforts to strengthen EU foreign policy activity. I have been trying to explain the 7 dimensions of the Middle East war, but when you see the whole southern neighborhood, the Middle East and North Africa region, we have 7 weak states and we have 10 interstate wars and conflicts. And the EU seems to me overstretched with all these challenges. But on the other hand, they have the Team Europe initiative. You know, since years they tried, you know, to assemble a couple of member states who are interested in the one or the other policy field to support it. So we have 27 member states. You know, they can distribute the tasks of dealing with these conflicts and wars between member states. Not all 27 have to deal with all of these conflicts. There are mechanisms, you know, to distribute the challenges and then to be more effective. And I think the Team Europe aspect has a potential. And if member states then, when they decide, okay, we are working on Syria, or we are working on Libya, or we are working on Israel-Palestine, to be committed to that for a couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for your thoughts on the summit and on the overall EU-GCC relations. I see also 2 questions in the Q&A, and I also have another 1 or 2 questions myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all of them out there, and then I'll give you the floor to each of you, having in mind that also we have about 8 minutes left. So firstly, the questions from the audience. First one is, how would the potential different outcomes of the US election affect the Middle East crisis, a Trump 2 or a Harris 1 administration? And second question, how should the new commissioner designate for the Mediterranean approach or address the conflict in the Middle East? I think I'm just trying to paraphrase the question. How should the EU take the lead in the Middle East? Is it through the Commissioner for Mediterranean? How would this work in practice? Another question that I had in my mind relates also to the Gulf states, and how do the Gulf states see the potential escalation between Iran and Israel? And I think I'll leave it there at these 3 questions for now. And I would like to give you the floor, Adnan, because I know you have to leave sharply at past. So I just want to make sure you have the chance to come in again and share your thoughts with us, and then I'll go back to Aniseh and the rest of the panel. Please, Adnan.
Thank you so much, Mihai. This conversation, I enjoyed very much. Maybe tackling the EU commissioner approach question, but not going into depth because I'm too negligent about its substance. But what I wanted to stress is also what's happening today in Brussels, the summit. What is really necessary is for Europeans to not only hear what their Arab counterparts say, but to really listen to what they say. The statements that we've heard from capitals across the region in the past year have been explicit to the core and outlining the dangers and the situation the region is maneuvering into. And they have also made clear their positions. I don't know how much more explicit the foreign ministers of all of these countries, and I just have the words of the Jordanian foreign minister in his meeting with his German counterpart in mind. The regional agency and the emerging roles that Christian mentioned have to be recognized, because they can, in fact, compensate for the limits of European leverage in that region. If you listen carefully and if you, for once, recognize the legitimate security concerns, which tackles your last question, Mihai. Obviously, all of the GCC countries are enormously worried about Israeli-Iranian or Iranian-American escalation because their region is potentially going to be put on fire. What the GCC countries and Iran have accomplished in the past 2 years had been tremendous in terms of regional rapprochement, which has so far avoided from the fire of the Levant being transferred to the Gulf region. This may change, and I think this is also part of the messaging that Foreign Minister Arakci is taking with him to the many capitals he's traveling to. Finally, on the US elections, I believe that there is no whatsoever reason to believe that with either candidate things are going to be easier. There are difficulties and complexities with regards to every single one. Donald Trump is the one who may in fact be ambitious and bold enough to strike a grand deal, but before that grand deal can be sealed, he wants to make a point, and he will want to make a point in weakening Iran severely before forcing Iran into a deal that may in fact come with a lot of concessions. On the other side, Democrats might actually have more brain cells in their team to develop some sort of enduring de-escalation path. So if, in my humble opinion, the path towards de-escalation is more likely with an incoming Harris administration, taking into consideration what kind of team she would assemble around her presidency. With that, back to you, Mihai.
Thank you so much, Adnan, and thank you very much for your presence today and for your thoughts. I know you have to leave, probably will go a few minutes over time, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you very much and hope to see you again soon with us. Now I would like to go back to our panel, and I'm looking at you, Aniseh, with these 3 questions from earlier in mind. Feel free to touch upon whatever you feel is most relevant from your perspective.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to add a few words on the Gulf dimension because I think it's very important, in particular when it comes to their concerns with the current escalation. I think what we have seen in terms of dialogue between Iran and the Gulf, especially since October 1st, has been quite unprecedented. We have seen the first foreign minister meetings in Doha 2 days after Iran attacked Israel on the 1st of October. Then we have seen Arakci traveling, as Adnan mentioned, to several capitals, but even to Riyadh last week. And then we have seen, obviously, Oman and Qatar as well. And I think what the message is from the Gulf is really that they don't want a repeat of 2019. We have seen what escalation means for them. They were the countries which were directly targeted by Iran-backed proxies when escalation took place between Iran and the United States back then, with energy facilities being the target, particularly when Saudi facilities were attacked in 2019, and the UAE also being a target. So they don't want a repeat of 2019. They know that the security guarantees provided by the US are not enough to protect them from the repercussion of escalation, and they are trying to avoid escalation from happening in the first place. And this is why the outreach and dialogue with Iran is taking place, especially given that one of the scenarios that I mentioned before in the potential attacks from Israel towards Iran includes energy facilities and infrastructure. And we know what that could mean also potentially for Iran's retaliation, or if not directly from Iran, Iran-backed groups. We have seen Hezbollah threatening, for instance, that if Iran's energy facilities are attacked, then this would mean also potentially other countries' facilities, meaning the Gulf ones, being targeted as well in response. So they're aware of what the potential implications are for them. They are very wary that de-escalation is very much aware that the de-escalation is needed, and despite their limited tools, I think coalescing and having a united stance is seen as one way to at least manifest their voice and their stance, waiting for the actors that actually have influence, namely the United States and Europe, to do their job and make sure that de-escalation actually takes place. I leave it there, but thanks for the very, very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Aniseh. Thank you very much for your insights, especially now in your last intervention on the impact on GCC. I see we're quite short on time, but I still want to give the floor back to Almut and Christian for some last thoughts, or maybe some thoughts on the previous 3 questions that were posed. But just I had something also in mind, and my sort of question is, given the current situation now, and you both hinted at this here and there, can we still envision a two-state solution, a Middle East peace process at this point? The floor is yours. Maybe Almut, we can start with you and then give the floor to Christian and then end.
Sure, thanks, Mihai, and thank you for the questions. Just to say, the question on the US, which has already been covered by colleagues, is a very important one, yet a very complex one, and just to flag that this is one aspect we will be picking up in a more granular way in a follow-up of this series. So please join in again then for such a discussion, diving into the US angle nearer to the outcome of the elections. There was also a question on the role of the new commissioner for the Mediterranean and her possible role in the Middle East peace process. I think we should be no illusion about what it would take for the Union to matter in any such negotiating environment, should it start again, which we can hope for. I don't assume that this would be a responsibility of the commissioner for the Mediterranean. It would be much higher up the ownership for that, and it would have to be a coordinated position at the top of the European Commission and in the European Council to be able to carry the weight that is needed. Having said that, there are important other areas, and of course, the commissioner would then travel with also the backing and the messaging that is coming with that. But she will also have other areas where she can draw on potential of the Union and member states, to play a role in the region. And this is also not small. And Christian, Hanelt, and other colleagues have worked on that. We know about a lot of good starting points from the earlier days of the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. And so I don't want to put down, her role. I just want to say any meaningful political weight would require a different setup. This would not be primarily her role, in my understanding. And your last question, Mihai, I think was on, I think Christian is best suited with all his experience on the many years of this conflict. Personally, things are looking much more difficult at the moment, but this is nothing we should lose out of sight. It's actually at the very core, the resolution of this conflict, of a lot of things that are happening in the Middle East right now. Thanks.
I hope nobody will blame you when I say I still have some optimism, in spite I really observe, even in person, the development of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since the Madrid Peace Conference from 1991, where I was also in person. Look, beyond this very sad war, there are still a lot of Israeli-Palestinian initiatives on the ground who are working for reconciliation, for somehow of negotiation and resolution of their Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If they ask us to help them, we should help them, that they can work on the ground in their societies to work for a peaceful resolution.
Thank you, Christian. And on this note, I would like to thank to all our speakers for their insights today. Thank you to all participants. As Almut mentioned, we'll continue the conversation about Middle East with an event every month. In November, most likely, the main point of discussion will be the impact of the US elections and the new president's stance on the Middle East, while of course keeping in the discussion the developments on the ground, the impact on the EU, and other aspects such as the humanitarian one, which is extremely relevant. Once again, thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a very nice day. Thank you.